I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. We are slowly wrapping up season 12, but I've been really enjoying these last few conversations. Today we have a very special guest with us, Howard Stevenson. He is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education and Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A leading clinical psychologist, researcher, and practitioner, his work focuses on helping children, families, and schools navigate racial stress and trauma. Through his development of racial literacy practices and deep partnerships with community organizations, his work has become he has become a national figure in the movement for educational equity, psychological well-being, and healing justice for youth of color. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
I'm really excited for today's conversation. I feel like oftentimes we can think of schools as these places where it's all about learning in terms of, your maths and sciences and social studies, but we forget that it is also a space where we develop as humans. We learn to connect with people, we learn to love, we learn to, feel in community. And so there's so much more that happens at a school outside of just your development of your intellectual capacity. So super excited to learn more about that today, but I love starting with origin stories. How did you come to find your passion and love for this particular space and field?
Thank you for that. And how do I pronounce your name? Is it?
It's the way I normally tell people. It's like mouth with the G, so Gautam.
Gautam. Okay, thank you, Gautam. Please call me Howard. The story I have used often is the idea of growing up in a pretty segregated but poor neighborhood in the woods in southern Delaware, and part of that. Growing up in a family with parents who were culturally different from each other, they argued a lot over issues of dignity and best place to raise a child. And I'm the oldest of three. My father grew up in southern Delaware, which is culturally like Mississippi or Alabama at the time. And there are two Delawares. Northern Delaware is more modern, and southern Delaware is really literally like the rural South. That's where my father grew up. My mother grew up in North Philly, and the cultural difference between them was incredible. So watching them argue their different strategies. So my brother and sister and I, very close in age, our stories are kind of interwoven to their capacity to battle with each other, but also work together. And so I was always interested in, or found myself people coming and sharing very personal things without me asking. Whether it was since I was 5 years old, and then I found out you could get paid for this kind of stuff. And I've been doing that for even trying to get away from it for a while as a psychologist. My brother, his name is Brian Stevenson. He's a very famous lawyer. He started the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama, and so part of our family legacy would be, how do you navigate justice? And for me, it was around how do you heal people as they're navigating injustice. And his work has been around challenging the death penalty, but also challenging the theory that slavery is not over. It's just evolved to what we think of now as mass incarceration and a host of other societal systemic oppressions. And so our family kind of grew up in that kind of context, grew up in a Black AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which has a theology of faith and fight. So you fight. It's okay to fight back for what you believe in. And so I think the way I think about psychology and the way we do our work in my center, the Resilience Empowerment Collaborative, is to think about how you bring your own story to the problems that we're facing in the world instead of borrowing other people's narratives about you. And then I'll end this by saying the proverb that we use that's helped me navigate being in a place like Penn which is culturally different from where I grew up. Is this African proverb that goes, "The lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it." And in that sense, we take this whether we're working in schools with elementary, middle, high school, whether we're working in colleges, whether we're working at a senior citizen homes, which I go to as well to help people figure out their narrative, which is an emotional process. And the last thing I'll say, I started a nonprofit, co-founded with a beautiful colleague, Dr. Brian Peterson. Where we train professionals how to tell their story, navigating issues of injustice and race and difference. So,
I mean, this is so much of what you're saying is so beautiful. And one of the things that I grew up, I was telling you earlier, in the Bay Area, and something that I was always really fascinated by is, the last I checked, the number that I got was 80% of the students of the school that I went to are children of immigrants. And when I say children of immigrants, I mean from all over the world. And it's fascinating looking back at it now, because I yearn to, if I could go back to those times, I would have spent so much time learning about each person and what their lives were like, not at school, but from home. You know, what types of foods did you eat? What were the kind of ideas that you were hearing thrown around in the house? Because you have pretty much people from around the world all in the same place. Yet, what ended up seeming to happen is everyone kind of masked, everyone presented a mask. Everyone was like, okay, this is how I am. This is my understanding of what it means to be American, and I'm going to show up in this way. And there was no real being seen, I guess, in that way of like, what is really your life like? And so ever since then, I've been really fascinated. Even as you were sharing, I feel like something that every time I sit in public transportation, I get so fascinated to just watch everyone around me, because I'm like, each person has such a different way of understanding the world around them. And it is, I think the proverb you used was so beautiful. And I guess when we think about in the context of schools, what are some of the examples you've seen where people have been able to kind of share their story and feel seen in that? And I guess not ridiculed or mocked for the differences that they might share.
Thank you for the question. I think if we lived in a world where people weren't trying to direct you to be a certain kind of human being, this wouldn't matter as much, right? But I think when we all went to school the way you described, we were all trying not to be targeted. So we tried to blend in certain ways, and hide our stories. And in some of the work we do with folks who are different, I use this phrase that I belong at the University of Pennsylvania, but I do not fit in. And part of that is this: we have the skills, we have the talents, we have the capacity, but sometimes we shrink ourselves and who we are and our story in order to not stand out or cause that narrative of hate to come at us. And so part of, for me, the way it's really been helpful is that since so many people have been successful at hiding their story, it's a cost to health and productivity in the long run. That's at least a lot of the work that we're theorizing, that to swallow yourself, to shrink yourself, has benefits and costs. And the question is, are you able to count the costs to your health and your relationships, and for standing up for things that aren't fair for other people? And because then you're pulled to a place of, could I lose what I have in these particular spaces? And schools are no different. You could argue we learn in school how to be our best acting selves.
Do you feel like we need to connect some of this work to productivity at the end of the day? Like, what if it's being seen or being in your voice has nothing? What if it doesn't matter how it affects productivity?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because we can be so successful hiding ourselves. So you can get paid better by hiding yourself. You can get more friends. You could argue you won't be alone in a world that. So why would you risk that? But the research on this is pretty clear to the degree that it shows up in some people are blocked access to opportunity as a function of following the rules, acting in the best ways, but still not getting the access. And that's true around issues of difference, around race in particular, we've been interested in, but around intersectional rejection because of your difference. And so the research on its impact on your health outcomes is pretty clear that you run into stressful, rejecting experiences at work and play and home and neighborhoods. Your health is going to be affected. If your health is affected, your productivity is going to be affected. And that's even separate from identifying discrimination that's pretty bold, that's happening, that people can identify. Because you look like an immigrant, we're going to restrict your freedom. We don't even check if you're an immigrant. We don't even, it's brown skin becomes a marker that you don't belong. And I think that kind of stress over time not only affects your heart, it affects your brain, it affects your body, it affects your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting because some of your work covers this concept of like racial literacy. And I think it's a really important, I think living in this country, it's so important because it's not every cultural context are you forced to meet people who are so different from you on a daily basis. And while there are many places in this country where you could be in really homogenous circles, the rest of the country really isn't like that. And you are you just interact with such vast differences on quite a regular basis. And so learning how to navigate that without kind of creating this hatefulness in your heart, which a few episodes ago we talked about how democracy can only function at a high level so long as there is trust. And the second that trust is kind of broken, it can no longer function. And I feel like where we are today in some ways is a country where there's such little trust across differences, across people who may think, look different. And so that causes deep strains and tensions for democracy to function. So I think understanding racial literacy and thinking about what that means is super important. So when we talk about racial literacy, what does that mean?
So for me as a psychologist, as well as coming out of that AME faith that I was describing, and two parents who argue, there's a combination of thoughts. And the work started in the field of racial socialization, which is basically how do families protect their children from hate. And I was interested in Black and brown families in the beginning, but now very much interested in how any family, however you define family, tries to protect its children from hostility because of their difference. And part of that racial socialization research for 20 years, we found that the more parents or caregivers or family members prepared their children for the kind of rejection about their difference that they might run into in school, in playgrounds, travel teams, walking down the street in their own neighborhoods, walking down the street in other neighborhoods, through life, through high school, college, the more those children were better prepared to not only notice when those things happen, but to also not internalize those rejections as part of who they were. So the field of racial socialization, basically for decades, we looked at how do family members protect their children and eventually themselves from the hate that's going on in the world. Now, the challenge with that work is some parents called the talk really well. They were very detailed. Here's what I want you to do when. But others would be vague, right? And the lack of clarity in that giving the talk, we found that children just weren't prepared when the rejection was happening. So to be proud that you are from your neighborhood or because you're Black or brown, it's not enough of a protection against the rejection when folks are in your face, when friends, even your best friends, are in your face about your difference. And so racial literacy was an attempt to say, let's add some more clarity and specificity and directness, because these events of rejection are happening in our face. They're happening in our relationships with people we care about, even our friends that we don't like. If you're a middle schooler, you can't just give up even bad friends, because you might not have any friends at all. So you take a lot of hits. So when I work with middle schoolers, I'm interested in, what's your story about if you had a voice, right? What was your story if you wanted to show up as your own self, right? And that starts with noticing that this bothers you, that you are keeping awake, that you are hoping somebody doesn't say something. So you're going through issues of ruminations. What is it about me? And so over time, racial literacy is around how many skills can we teach young people and families to be better prepared, right? And not say, I wish I could have, I should have done that sort of regret that people have. And we've been working with children as young as elementary school, third graders, who are willing and able to tell stories, if you ask them, of situations that they're still bothered by 2, 3, 4 years later, and may even be in friendships with some of the folks who have offended them, and they have not gotten over it. So racial literacy is, how more skillful can we protect young people and families when these moments happen, so they don't linger, right? They don't affect your sleep quality. They don't affect your focus on schooling.
So it seems like it's more for the person who might feel like their stories can't be seen or heard, as opposed to a collective, I guess, acceptance of difference in some ways.
No, and in fact, it would be for anyone. And part of the issue is, let's say you're not a target, but you're learning from other people that it's okay to dehumanize another person, which you might not even define as dehumanization, just a joke or ridicule, without having a connection to how those particular jokes are related to a statement of who you can be in this space with us, right? And that could be at work, that could be in a host of places. But the research on this is, it's also linked to who is actually important, who actually is smart enough, who actually is going to make it to the last decision around getting the job. That these attitudes about you being dehumanized in these small ways are linked to larger decisions that might be made about you. And so everybody's cool as long as they're not targeted. The question is, the issue is how long. The other issue is, it creates a certain acceptance of a fear of difference, that I just hope no one blames me for being a hateful person, right, or a racist. And there's some great research around the fear of appearing prejudiced, right? There's this great research that looks at, are you driving your decision making and your relationships based on the people seeing you as a good person? But the fear is that if they could see me as somebody who actually is racist, that fear drives a lot of bad decision making. And so the stress related to that, and this is where racial stress is important, or other kinds of identity-based stress, that stress can undermine your capacity to lead. It could also, even if you're not targeted as somebody who could be inferior, there's a lot more research now on what if somebody thinks that I'm now an oppressor, and that also, instead of getting help for that, asking for skills that would improve your capacity to build relationships with people different from you, you just hope and pray it never comes up. Or you avoid and create climates where people know that you're not a really competent person in this area.
Something I find to be really interesting in this particular country is, I guess this is everywhere, how many lines of differences exist. So you clearly have your socioeconomic status, your race, your culture, your religion. Would you say that racial literacy carries over to, I think this exists in so many different metrics, where if someone is a farmer from Idaho moves into a big city like Los Angeles, their stories may necessarily not really be seen or heard, and some of the things that they might do may look weird. But
Yes,
do you feel like the kind of the ideas behind racial literacy can then be translated over many different lines of differences?
absolutely. In fact, we've rewritten our sort of advertising around the racial literacy as a resilience model for a very diverse uh, class of identity-based conflicts and microaggressions. And the trainers we've had have always been diverse, and part of the rule it's called the Lion Story. Um, and part of we have very diverse trainers, and part of the rule is you have to bring your own story as a trainer to be a part of our work, and you have to practice it so that it's comfortable for you, because people should have the right to question and challenge, or you're going to run into that in life in general. Some are educators, some are lawyers, some are judges. The range is amazing, but part of the challenge, I would say, for every individual, what you're describing is absolutely right on. That people will, we are frightened by a host of very diverse, very very unique differences. Systemically, though, we have had a history in this society to be fearful of some things a little bit more than others, even if we're restrictive about many differences. And we are seeing in history how being an immigrant now is top of the list, you could argue. You could argue, though, that racism has always been top of the list, given the way even this government has sought to wipe out Black history. You say, of all the things you wanted to erase, right, in a museum, you pick that. Can you explain to me that? And so we could explain why that would be happening, but I think the issue of all these differences that you're bringing up, the question is, why are people so threatened when they feel overwhelmed by difference?
Yeah. I mean, and I think this is the most fundamental question that often seems to be pervasive across every society, where when you have someone or something come that you don't fully understand, you have two ways to respond, either one with curiosity or one with fear. And it seems to just be easier to respond with fear because you get to shell up and feel protected, where when you respond with curiosity, you allow yourself a little vulnerable to be hurt. But it is only through that curiosity can you then understand what you don't know. And I feel like that at its core is really hard. I think kids naturally do it, but then you learn to just use fear as your defense mechanism more and more and more. I find children to be so fascinating when they interact with somebody who maybe has a disability, or so, where they're just so open to be like, what's going on? Like, what, they don't see the other person as someone to like be guarded around, or not, they're just curious often. And I feel like the slow indoctrination of responding with fear seems to be something that we pick up over the years.
Yes, and you could argue children are the best at interpreting more accurately than not what adults do that adults are hiding or trying to hide from them. And in a sense, it's the nonverbals they're able to pick up, because speaking isn't as useful a way to understand what people do. And so that's a form of racial or identity-based socialization. I listen to what my parents or adults say, but then I also watch what they actually do under very stressful moments. So if in that sense, I think a great example of how parents or adults teach children, I just shared with my students when Philando Castile was murdered in the back of his car, or while he was driving in the front of his car by a police officer. And there's a 4-year-old daughter in the back who witnesses all of this. But if you watch the video all the way through, despite the horror of him being shot by the police officer who's clearly threatened, even though he's clearly being upfront, is the way the daughter has almost learned through socialization from perhaps her parents on how to manage a crisis or be in a crisis. And so she's 4 years old. And so you could see a 4-year-old has learned and picked up what her parents and her mother perhaps too, who is narrating this whole scenario with her phone. So the mother is being detailed at being kind to the dangerous cop while seeing that her partner is dying, and yet following a set of rules. So I think what we see a lot of times, curiosity, yes, and fear, but there's also this combination where children or adults from very different backgrounds are afraid to take the risk, but they're still curious, right? And some, you could argue, I've given up on curiosity. I need a black and white worldview in order to survive, no matter what the consequences. And we've seen this in Chicago and Minneapolis. Reason doesn't matter. So we're interested in helping, connecting with even folks who are scared and curious. And in many respects, I would say by 4 years old, children have learned quite a bit around the fears and the curiosity of the people that are around them.
I'm so curious to, I guess, learn a bit more about the actual practices to bring about racial literacy, because I think what can sometimes happen, and this is just in my own personal experience, is, I think food and dancing, I think, is two great ways to kind of introduce someone into a culture, but and fashion. But I think those are all things that don't actually connect to the humans who are actually in creation of it. So it's very easy to be like, I like their food, I want to keep the food, but the people actually not really. Or you can do that with the dancing, the culture, the way they speak.
Sure.
But to truly accept the person as well requires something more than just introduction into their practices. You have to, it's something more than just, I don't know. And so when we talk about developing racial literacy or understanding of the other, what are some of the practices? And then how do you differentiate between simply just being exposed to cultures versus actually connecting and understanding the people behind those cultures?
Yeah, I think those rituals are good lenses into a culture, right? That if I agree to dance, if I agree to eat the food, that I might get a lesson in a way. There are ways that could take me into a deeper place. But when you find people, I think even they're afraid to go deeper, right? I might like the food, but don't give me all the details behind it, what's cultural about it, because that violates a certain assumption. I think that's the reality of our engagement with difference for some people. And there's a joke from one of the Daily Show hosts, and I'm forgetting who said, if you're going to be anti-immigrant, you can't eat their food, right? So it's a joke around your depth of understanding of who a human is not stuck at just because you actually ate some food. And I think the fear, the stress of difference is part of the challenge, right? And you could argue we have communities and gated communities being built all the time in our country. We stay separate physically from people who are different from us. And the more wealthy you are, you have that capacity. We know that children are more likely to be going to less diverse schooling from K through 12 across the country. And if you are paying for private schooling, it's actually going to be worse. And so there's a push away from diversity or being in the context of culturally different people who have rituals, who have lessons to teach us. And I think some call that hate. But I guess the question I'd have for you is like, what do you do with that notion, knowing that some people aren't going to go deeper out of a fear that I may lose myself, right? And or something bad could happen, or my children might get exposed beyond the level that I want. And I think the hate that we're seeing has a vitriol to it that about difference without investigating or what could this be? Who could? There's a sort of clarity of thought around who is good and who is not simply by their difference. And that's scary, but it's also historic.
Yeah. And I guess in some contexts, because that is the tension, right? I mean, for example, even in my experience growing up in the States, I come from this southern state in India called Tamil Nadu, where people are really, really proud of, like, a lot of people joke about that state for that, because people from there are really proud of the language, the culture. They really hold on to it tight. So when you see Tamil communities in the US, at least in my experience, they're very kind of homogenous. They stay around each other, and exposure to other cultures is often viewed as like, oh, like you've lost your culture, you don't have your roots anymore, who are you going to be? And so openness is often very much weaponized against you, because it's like, oh, now you're no longer what you once were when, the way our ancestors were, and therefore you've lost your way. And so that was something I had to really, throughout my life understand, okay, what is because I've always loved getting to meet new people and changing. And one of the consequences of that is I am no longer accepted in that same way by my community, because I have changed. I have become quite different from the core. And so that, I think, can sometimes, like what you said, be the fear that many people share, because it's like, if you're exposed to too much, I won't be able to control the way that you turn out. And sometimes people use culture as a means of control. There's so much going on that I feel that is guised under the belief of like culture but there is a lot of control, I think, of a desire to make you view the world the way I want you to view it.
Yeah. Well, you could argue, this is great point. You could argue that racial literacy, the way we try to think about it and develop and use it, is to bring more clarity on what people mean when they say culture or race, or what does the literacy mean for you. And so when you were describing your community, it reminded me of mine and the church that my family grew up in, that people didn't finish sixth grade in southern Delaware because there were no, my father, who grew up, had to go to northern Delaware, which would have been like going from London to Greece. That's how far away that people stayed in their area. They didn't move outside of that space. And it literally is 50 miles away. It was being like going away to another country. So he was able to go to high school, but he had to pretend to have a play aunt who was a family member to get through high school. But the message has always been from those church people who only had a sixth grade education: be careful when you go away from us, because you're going to lose the beauty and the history of where you came from. And when I, as a kid, was like, oh man, I can't wait to get out, I was saying, I was naive, because they weren't really saying don't go. They were saying don't forget who you are. And that was more central to your humanity, to your sense of spiritual connection to us. Because once you lose your connection to us, you lose your connection to the spirit, to the soul, to the earth. And that is more dangerous than anything else. No matter how many degrees you get, that's cute, that's nice. But losing your soul and yourself, that's scarier. So part of literacy is, can we get people to share, here's why I'm so hard on you remembering us and remembering your language and your style and your culture. It's for your health. So we can help people communicate a whole lot better in their story. Why? And children will always say, I don't know why I have to go to the same thing over and over again. And we can help families even come to a place of, what's your story as to why it's important that your child not lose themselves in another space, another world.
Yeah. And I just feel like different ideas serve complete different contexts. In this country, it's almost, I don't even know how you would, I know how you would get through it, but you would have to develop so much hatefulness within yourself to be like, difference is bad. And, I often find this to be really interesting, because depending on, if we're going to use this term of racial literacy, depending on how literate someone is with understanding different cultures and races, I feel like when I explain things like, oh, my parents were arranged marriage, like my entire family's entire history has always been an arranged marriage, and that was like a big part of my thinking of love growing up. If someone has two ways to respond to that: one with clear judgment of like, that seems so backward, how could that be, or with a lens of curiosity of like, how does that actually work? Like, it's that open-mindedness in a lot of ways, I think, has to be the core within. Otherwise, there's just no chance we'll be able to see each other. And I think, it's, I think one thing that's been really interesting being an immigrant, also just from my side, is like, it was very clear from a young child how different groups and cultures in the US was. And so when I would have to like understand what it meant to be American for me, I would either have to borrow from Black culture or like from white culture. I'd have to like emulate based on like what was around me. And but that makes it so clear how kind of fundamentally different a lot of spaces in the US can be, but not that one's better or worse, but different.
Yes. But you're saying your experience in that difference journey is that your lens is still not better, but different. Other people come to that difference with a very different lens. And that is, you could argue that this culture, and my brother has made it very clear around the work he's done at the Equal Justice Initiative, in the museum, that slavery hasn't changed. It hasn't evolved. It hasn't gone away. It's just evolved. So the narrative that because you have certain skin color, there's something inferior about you. And you could argue that people can learn that as a culture just as easily as we can learn that diversity is not here to harm you. And along with that cultural experience comes your views on use of violence or the use of making decisions and exclusion for some people over others. And America has the amazingly long history at keeping these differences separate and not equal. And I think you could argue knowing the history of a culture gives you a better lens on what is actually possible. Malefe Asante has this term, and it helped me get through Penn, where he was talking about all cultures create an idea of what a space is to be, an epistemology, a study of what is knowledge. And he described Western sort of epistemologies of knowledge as believing that there are other cultural views and other kinds of societies. But he said the unique part about the Western view is that it believes it's better than every other view. So it doesn't discount other cultures or other views, but to be supreme in that view is not true in all cultures. And so this term he came up with is called, it's a peculiar arrogance, which is the arrogance of not knowing what it is that they do not know, yet they speak as if they know what all of us need to know. And I found that incredibly useful because it will seem strange to many of us to run into teachers, police officers, pastors, and presidents who believe in difference, just that they're superior to it.
As you were saying, something popped in my head. I'm going to try to word vomit around this idea, but I'm really curious to what you think, because I think one of the reasons, because growing up in this country, I very much felt exactly what you said. I was like, all right, the United States, number one, everything we believe, number one, every other. I really did feel that way for so long until I started traveling, until I left the country, until I was like, okay, that is so ridiculous. The kind of the centric view of Americans is something that of people from the United States is something I feel like so many people around the world know and kind of ridicule sometimes, because it really does feel sometimes, oh, this seems to be the center of the entire planet, which it's not at all. But the one reason I hypothesize that could be is because when we think about diversity, even when like universities talk about the value of diversity, they usually try to like connect it to some, it's always like a means to an end. Like, oh, if we have diverse, then we can have, you know, better learning spaces and this and that. And if we're more racially aware, we could be more productive, and we can actually, by incorporating women into the workforce, we can actually have a stronger economy. It's every view is kind of connected in some way or another to improving productivity or the economy, which means that any view that you hold has to quote unquote be the best, because it will then lead to these like outcomes that you believe to be the best. But I feel like we are ignoring that how well the economy functions is just one particular value measure of like what a good society or a life is. I mean, connection, there's just so many other things that could be the final end and not as a means to an end, where I feel like if we did that, if we were able to have that conversation and really shift around what we think is like the ultimate value, then perhaps these other pieces fall into place more naturally, where you don't need to connect it to, if we do this, then the economy will be stronger.
Yes, and I think if you had an equal world, that might make sense. But people who are making those arguments are because they have not been allowed to be made in the past. So particularly around business success or financial benefits of companies that actually, when they bring diversity, changes climates in those companies. And they've been able to, it's basically, this is research that wasn't allowed to be done before, but we find, oh my gosh, we got better outcomes and productivity by company and by climate. But that's a very small pebble in a larger lake of resistance to even do that research or support or fund that kind of research. You could argue that we've just in the last 15 to 20 years connected the racism or rejection of your difference to health outcomes like sleep quality, right? We can track sleep quality for children related to their experiences of hate in school. So you're right on one level that it feels like cherry picking, but really it has not even been allowed to be a part of the conversation in just the last 20, 25 years. And so prior to that, we only studied stress. We never studied racial stress. We never studied immigrant stress. And so we're losing out on information to understand what consequences, what costs are there for people who are immigrants who are hated on because of difference than just a generalized stress. I don't make enough money. I have too many children, or I have a hard time finding a job. Having a hard time finding a job and I'm skilled because I'm from another country is a different stressor on one's well-being than I don't have a job.
Kind of connecting these, to better understand the human experience, it requires a deeper and deeper kind of layered analysis of what it means to be.
Yes.
So when I guess connecting this to schools, one of the hardest things I think is, I mean, even in my experience of schools, I feel like when we talked about differences, culture, or race, I mean, it was always, we didn't really talk about it. And if we did, it was just really awkward. There was no real, we were all just walking on eggshells. There was no real kind of exposure to that, the vast difference that existed in the classroom itself. How do you then work with, I mean, this has to be extremely structural, where you have to work with teachers, but to work with the teachers, you got to work with, you got to work with councils and curriculum in general. But how do you, I guess, bring about a difference in bringing awareness about, I guess, the whole conversation we've been having so far?
Sure. Great question. And it's related to that proverb, the lion story will never be known as long as the hunters are the ones to tell it. And what we mean by that in our work, that my story is not better than your story, and your story is not better than mine. But there's a beauty and an importance to everyone's story. The problem is you won't get to that beauty or that importance if you don't face the ugly parts of it as well as the beautiful parts. And you have to fight for your narrative in a world that's trying to that's stressed and fearful of your difference to make you just like everybody else. So we start with what is your story, right? And if you were not a worry that somebody might tear it apart, and we think this is related to health, we help people connect to the experiences in their life around difference that have been painful that they've swallowed. And we work from third graders to folks who are octogenarians. And what we find is that when you're able to connect to your story, you've forgotten some things about what it's like to be different if you've shape-shifted yourself to try to blend in so much. And we could tell ourselves that's no big deal. It's a small cost until you review it again, until you reflect on what has happened to you. And more people, when they engage their stories, they realize the cost emotionally to their lives. And once they do that, they might have a different thought around, what if I wanted to stand up against somebody who was being mistreated? You could argue that we're so stressed at being misperceived that we are immobile. We basically are afraid to act. And when you see someone like Alex Preddy, the nurse who literally sacrificed his life, he had an intentionality about how he was going to go up against injustice. And I would argue so many of us are in a liminal space. We don't have a story. We're not sure of our story. We're not sure what we would fight for. We're still hoping for the country that we live in to go back to where it's not so polemic. And I would argue that's a statement of being unprepared for the obvious battle in our faces. And so we can help people minimize the stress of being thought of as somebody who doesn't know. Or we can help people, even somebody comes at you and it stresses you out, but you can still stand your ground and share your piece without walking away, without pretending you didn't see it, without being the kind of leader that doesn't want to cause conflict. And right now we need folks who are afraid to step up as opposed to not see it and avoid it. And I think we're at a time now, it's harder for people to pretend that really wasn't a really bad thing that just happened around humanity.
Yeah.
So where do you find your voice would be a question I would throw out. How do you find your voice in these moments that are indisputably hateful?
I feel like one of my favorite things that I had ever done in school was in our econ class, or our government class, we were asked to, I guess mandated, to go to at least one city council meeting and to speak up on anything you cared about. I remember I went to one and we were talking about just the kind of blowing up of just how many homes are being built without really taking care of the tensions that adds to schools, transportation, to all these things. Houses were just being built willy-nilly in Fremont. And so I remember being there and I gave a little talk for 30 seconds or whatever on the podium about how it was affecting us at school. And that was it was just a magnificent experience, feeling like, one, what I said mattered, two, like I had a space to actually speak, and three, actually seeing the space where a lot of decisions were being made for our city. I think one of the big things is sometimes a lot of people are only exposed to news at the federal level, which feels so distant and it feels so impossible to make any change that you end up feeling really hopeless because you're like, okay, with this country with 350 million people, how am I ever supposed to make a change? But I think when you actually really just narrow it down to your city, and given that you don't live in a city like New York or Los Angeles, because then also it's a little a little difficult, but given you're in a smaller city to some extent, there are a lot of things that you can do, even if it's not politically, by building a group of 10 people, cleaning up the trash on the streets. And I think there are ways in which and maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm being a little optimistic, but I do feel like you can at least agency has to be something that's developed in steps, and you can't go to like, I want to change the whole country without
Right.
all the tiny, and I don't think that's ever possible, but without the tiny steps that it takes to get there. So can I
Yeah.
clean up the trash on my street, and then
Sure.
then can I like lead 5 people to go do the same work, and then 10, it has to kind of be built like that. And I think a lot of the fear can sometimes happen in the loss of agency, because we want these huge changes that seem too overwhelming to accomplish.
Yes. And I do think you're catching on to that what the consequences if you feel hopeless, or what happens to folks when they actually feel excited about the potential of change. Um, and as you were talking, I was thinking, part of the issue of the history of this country is, and I think this latest administration to take out Black history or from schools, is they understood that in that history to stay hopeful. Well, how do you stay hopeful when you are running into barriers of rejection in other places, whether in the federal government or even in your local government? And what sometimes happens is people start hopeful, but they lose that hope because they don't have a plan. And yet we have a history of education that we can learn how you navigate it feeling hopeless. What do you do if you want to pull a collective together? How do you resolve conflicts in a group of people who you started out liking, but they started differing from you in ways that made it challenging? How do you stay in that battle with like-minded people, not people who you would think would be against you? And I would argue that the better preparation for that kind of hopefulness and agency means we have to depend better on history and what is learned instead of from scratch. You could say even a cleanup on a Saturday of a neighborhood takes leadership, takes a certain energy, a charisma, or a willingness to be vulnerable when most people are giving up. That's the history of progress in this country by people with very little resources. And I'm just saying we need to look when folks are trying to take away the tools. What are the skills necessary to do that? Absolutely, absolutely. And you're seeing rebellion in this country in ways that schools are the best places to learn how to do that in increments and to realize not giving up. I was at Boston Children's Hospital a few weeks ago, and some of the senior psychiatrists, one of them said, I'm exhausted. And you could tell in the voice after witnessing everything, there was almost like a give up. And I appreciate that for somebody who's trying to help people manage trauma. But exhaustion is just one of multiple coping options for running into adversity. And hiding is not going to get you to a better place. And so what can I learn to do to fight back? So you asked a question earlier. So creating climates where people's stories are appreciated is absolutely essential, even if they're telling their stories is painful. If you create the climate, and that's what we do in our work, we create a climate for third graders to tell stories about difference when they were rejected. And then we teach them strategies to notice the harm that has come from those moments, not exaggerate the harm and not minimize the harm. And then we teach them comeback lines that they never have to use, but would be the ones they choose that would address the harm at its most problematic. So, and we can practice some very let's say funny comeback lines. We can practice some that are rude as all get out. But the goal is to stretch your emotional expression and appreciation of yourself and your story and your body and your thoughts. And you make the decision to use it or not. And certainly not to get yourself in trouble, but most certainly not to swallow as if this very powerful event didn't happen when it really did. And so
Wow.
I can within an hour get young people to be excited by the possibility as I have options besides just grin and bear it. And imagine if instead of an hour, we had 20 hours or 30 hours, right? And this would be true for folks who work in business, who have a really weird supervisor. So I think you get the idea that we have to learn how to fight back. We don't have to do it with our fists, and we don't have to say it with our words, but we have to imagine what would we do if we were going to stand up for ourselves, for our communities, for immigrants.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you're saying that's really sticking out to me in this conversation is I think it's only by knowing your story can you kind of, and honestly, the idea of a story is also so fascinating because there is no, in another way, there is no such thing as really a story, but it is a narrative that you create to kind of make sense of the kind of all the stuff that's happening. It's not, there's no like, it's not necessary. It doesn't have to necessarily be real, but it's a created understanding of all these kind of random events that's happened in our life, which is so beautiful. So it's an artistic process in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But one of the things that I have personally seen is I do a lot of interviews. I love talking to people, but reflection can be really scary because especially I think when you're working with adults who may not have had the space to really think, or they turn to work or they turn to something to run away from having to really like sit and process some of those emotions.
Yes.
And especially in dating, I've been experiencing this so much where I'm like, I'm realizing people don't really want to share about what their lives have been like because it's terrifying sometimes. And so I'm someone who loves hearing about people's stories. So I've been having to learn how to actually navigate people who might actually be very scared to share their story because one, they may not know or because they haven't reflected, or two, because they don't feel comfortable or trust me to hear those things. So how do you, for the people who maybe feel really scared to kind of look back and to really think about what their life has been like, how do you create space that makes them feel like it's okay to be scared and it's okay to be sad?
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question. And having worked with families and children who've been both physically and sexually abused, I've spent a lot of time with families and people who describe very clearly what it's like to be in a dark dungeon with no light and fear there's no way that they can ever get out of it. And so trauma, without seeing that, and then I've also seen those same people find their voice enough to see the light and get out of the light, and then to teach others about light is possible. And so if you haven't seen that, you could just imagine only darkness. So when I hear that people are afraid to reflect, I appreciate it, but I also want to support pushing up against it because it's hard to have a relationship if you can't reflect on the scary parts of your life. It's hard to keep a relationship. And that hasn't changed for centuries, even if people have become less open. But trauma doesn't have to last always. And if you find somebody that can hear your trauma, it's rare. It's a beginning of a beautiful relationship. You need people in your life who are not afraid of your pain, even if you are afraid of your pain. But there's no new science that's going to suggest that you being afraid of your pain is good for you. It's not for your health, for your wealth, for your family. And once you share your story, and then this is what I think my purpose in life, from all the faith and fighting that I've done, is that my job is to help people fall in love with their own narratives. And yes, it is a story that's created, but if you don't come up with your story, someone will give you one that you have to follow, whether you like it or not.
Damn.
You might not even be aware that you're following somebody else's narrative. Well, you didn't even know what story was, but you are going to follow a narrative. And the deeper you get to the ugly, the more, what Wade Nobles, a beautiful psychologist, said, we need to face the rupture and the splendor of our existence. That's how we are becoming human. We have to see the ugly And then you can experience a deeper part of life. And that's what racial literacy is about. That's what Lion's Story is about. And even young children who learn how to embrace their own narratives walk differently. They have a very different sense of agency. They can disagree and not bring it up, or they can disagree and decide, I will bring it up without hating on you, right? And we started bringing families together, and one thing we learned is we stopped having families start talking about these issues in a group. We separated the parents because the parents hadn't processed their own stories enough, where children were ready for stories that the parents couldn't handle. And one of the things the children told us was that my parents love me, and they always say good things about me. But when I'm in struggling, they keep giving me the mountaintop story about what's possible, and I'm in the valley. And basically, the children were saying, "Why don't you give me, Mom, Dad, a valley story? Tell me when you were, sucked, when you were struggling, because I'm in the valley. I can't see the mountain right now." And I think that was beautiful, right? So with Dr. Rihanna Anderson and I created this program called Embrace, as well as some other colleagues, where we separate the parents from the kids, and we work on the parents to get their stories connected, so they have something to bring to the table besides just parenting, for God's sake. And children appreciate that. They love the fact that their parents are vulnerable. So when you were 13 and people were coming at you with drugs, what did you do, Dad? That makes any sense?
Yeah. To see the human, I think sometimes, to not be these, I think sometimes I've often thought about just what the effects of professionalism is. And I think this is one of the really profound ones, where if you have to navigate a large chunk of your day as quote unquote a professional, it slowly starts seeping into how you start acting around your children, around your spouse, around everywhere, Yes. You become a professional in everything. You can no longer tap into that vulnerability or honesty to just be a flawed human being who's made mistakes, who's failed, who isn't perfect all the time. And it's terrible, because you can't really ever see the difficulties of what it means to exist, because everyone has to show up as perfect all the time.
Yes. And that's somebody else's story for sure. It's for a different world, different climate. But how much safer could you be if you could be flawed and not lose friends, or lose relationships, lose love?
Crazy, huh?
Yeah. Yep.
There was things that you were saying there that just honestly was such a good reminder for me of the types of relationships I would like to build one day, and the types of communities I want to. I'm just curious personally for you, as we start wrapping this up, what has your journey been like building spaces where you can be seen for your story or for being flawed? How has that been in your own personal journey?
It has been a journey. I think I've struggled through 2 marriages, and I have 2 beautiful sons from both of them, which I love. And I think my own struggle with being vulnerable has also been part of the struggle. But I love them dearly. They are absolutely amazing. And one is 35 and the other's 21. And part of when they were children, they were just the most creative minds. So I am blessed by them, because they hold me accountable to being vulnerable in a way that when I was trying to be professional, they kind of slapped me out of it in different ways. And initially it's like a shock, oh my gosh, I'm more seen than I thought I was. But over time is what you sit with a sense of gratefulness for that, because it's a kind of grace that your children could forgive you, or could love you in spite of, without conditions, right? In a world, we were doing something once. I have a history of leukemia. My 2 bouts of leukemia, and my oldest son Brian came and watched me over me in the hospital for a couple of weeks. And he was very good at making sure. And so he took a picture of me while I was trying to work on my laptop while getting chemo at the same time in the bed, and put this caption underneath of it: "Just chill, Dad." It's sort of like, actually it's right over here. But and his taking care of me was the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful memories that I have. And it challenges me to keep chilling. I can't forget it. It's not easily forgotten when I rev up to be what other people need, because it comes without a cost, without a, with love. Some people you can't trust. So those two keep me alive for sure. So I'm very proud of them. But it goes both ways. So
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I think on this show sometimes it gets usually so intellectual and academic, but I miss just like being human sometimes, because I'm like, it's so nice to just like hear real stories. Like ideas are so beautiful, and I love talking about them, but I think sometimes to be an academic is to stop being a person. Sometimes it feels like, and a lot of people have shared that, where it's like, I think Bell Hooks she writes very beautifully about this, where it's just like you have to stop being a human in some ways to simply just be an intellectual, where you miss that part of it. And some people have, it's truly a really hard, and it's not just maybe when they're on an interview, for example, they might be aware of the fact that, okay, maybe their department will listen, so they have that narrative also going on maybe, but I do think when you can penetrate through the kind of the image that we always need to portray to really get into something that's real, there's like a sense of, you can breathe a breath of fresh air for the first time.
Oh, yes.
So I appreciate, thank you for sharing, is what I wanted to say.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Yeah. Yes. But this has been an absolutely lovely conversation. I mean, truly, I really appreciate everything you had to share. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I can't wait to learn more about your work as well. You've been doing this for a while, right? You've been
it's been
7 years, 8, 12. How long have you been doing? I saw, was it 12 years or
so we're on season 12, but it's been year 4 now.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So long time. But yeah, it's cool. Time flies.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah, I want to say thank you all for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. It has been bittersweet as we start closing up season 12. I've really enjoyed all the conversations we've had, and today's conversation with Howard was amazing. If you've been enjoying the show, you can find more of us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and on the website reeducated.org. If you've enjoyed the show so far and would like to support, you can also find us on Patreon. The show could not run without the support of so many of you. And I hope you're having a great week. And as per usual, stay re-educated.